Alrighty, folks, I am going to have a honest discussion about some of my friends, some of my network here in the Silicon Valley. I'm going to invite Dana Dunford, also a Silicon Valley native and tech executive, to really talk about what we saw in this election. I think the Silicon Valley has historically been dark blue, like after Trump's first win, I saw people crying in the office. It felt like awake crying. But this election, I think, was different. We're going to talk about why. We're going to talk about what we've seen pre and post. Dana, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me back on today.
Absolutely. So I'm going to just ask you for a minute to rewind to 2016. I guess it was late 2015. It would have been Trump and Hillary Clinton, and that election was a tight one. And obviously Trump came out as a victor. I remember the next morning going to San Francisco, where my office was, right on Market, and it felt like somebody died. It was crazy that morning. What do you remember from way back when?
It was such a shock. There were people who didn't want to go to work, couldn't think about working, couldn't fathom that this was the results. It was so everyone in San Francisco was completely caught off guard, to the point where I think just work productivity had slowed down drastically for that whole week following, because people were suddenly starting to read the news, being like, what the heck just happened?
Yeah, I really do mean it. I remember going into the office, going upstairs, and it is the closest thing to a funeral that I've ever been to that wasn't a funeral. And to your point, it wasn't a day. It really was a week, and plenty of people, were suddenly out of the office, probably, commiserating and thinking about it. And that brings me to this election. In the Silicon Valley, a lot of my folks in my network, simply the behavior is different. The Silicon Valley this is not 2015. I don't think the Silicon Valley has skipped a beat, which really tells me maybe there was some quiet support underneath the covers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure there was quiet support. I think the big difference in this election was how much vocal support there was from key influencers and key people, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs from Silicon Valley who had built really successful businesses here in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. And to me, really that starts with David Sachs. I obviously only know David Sachs via the All In podcast.
Yeah.
He came out very early in support, and frankly was very public. I'm sure he took an ungodly amount of arrows and hates from the country, but he probably also took some very quiet pokes from, again, the Silicon Valley elite. I think Vinod was one that was very vocal, at least on X, about David being wrong. But David's initial energy really did create at least a small tidal wave of other Silicon Valley elite supporting and just not being as public. I think there is absolutely some truth to the fact that if you're in the Silicon Valley and you voted or wanted to vote for him, you could be ostracized. There is a clique that you could have been ostracized if you were as public as David. I think, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yes, I think so. Before this election, now when you look at actually media, it's shows like yours, Zuber, it's shows like the All In podcast, it's Mark Andreessen's podcasts as well, that a lot of Silicon Valley is listening to. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, and it's more prominent with venture capitalists. I think they have a lot more influence than founders. And here's why: founders are subject matter experts in just their business.
Right.
And so, you go really deep into that topic, you get that niche. But for anyone else who just wants a general overview landscape of what's changing in technology, what's a new cool trend across any and every industry, they'll go to a venture capitalist for that, because that's the job of a venture capitalist, is to invest in the next and most innovative companies in the world. And what we saw was, because of that, and there was such a strong following on all these media sources, whether it's podcasts or YouTube, of these venture capitalists being very outspoken about Trump, it actually, I think, to your point, had a lot more support than you would expect. And I think it was a lot more silent support.
Yes,
Yeah.
silent support.
And what was really interesting in our office, most of our office had said, they were still swinging towards blue. But what was really interesting is most people in our office, with the exception of a couple, I mentioned before the election, I'd asked, do you think Trump is going to win? And any other election you would have had, hell no, absolutely not. This was the first one where we went around the office in San Francisco and most people said, he's got a really good shot. We think he's going to win. And not only do we think he's going to win, we also think he's going to win the popular vote.
Wow.
And that was a really interesting shift, where the second now you're talking about popular vote, it's a whole different ballgame. And so I think that was interesting. And you're right, people went into the office almost if they didn't vote for him. And I think many or most in San Francisco didn't, still felt okay with it because they'd almost come to terms with it beforehand.
Yeah.
Because of what was happening with venture capitalists and how they were so outspoken about him. And then also I think Elon had a huge impact on that as well.
I agree.
And that would be from an entrepreneur perspective, but someone I've never seen, start as many businesses. He's the new Steve Jobs, right? With Starlink and Tesla and SpaceX. He really had such a high impact and influence as well on the community.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight, because I'm just trying to pull this together, because I was honestly shocked that the Silicon Valley, again, it still voted blue. It's just not as dark. And I've been here for 50 plus years, so it shocked me. I think David Sachs in the All In podcast and long form podcasts in general, I think has an outsized impact on the Silicon Valley. We have a lot of quote unquote nerds, a lot of people that consume content that way. A lot of folks that are really diverse, right? They may be, uniquely gifted at writing AI or whatever, but they want a larger knowledge base. They're hungry for knowledge. So I think long form content is an outsized influence. But to your point, if you go on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being nothing, 10 being a lot, I think David Sachs, All In podcast, long form podcast in general, probably had a 2 or 3 impact. But when you throw on top of that momentum, Elon Musk, who for a lot of people in the Silicon Valley is a freaking god, right? Yeah. Just say it the way it is. He can do no wrong. He creates, $1 trillion businesses, falling out of bed. I think that backing, and let's be clear, strong backing, I think it caused a lot of people to go, maybe I should go deeper. I'm not saying Elon Musk's support for Trump caused people to flip their votes immediately. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it caused them to get curious. And it was that curiosity that leads back to the podcast and leads back to kind of the full story. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think that you would have just written off Trump, or all of Silicon Valley would have pretty much written him off.
No doubt.
With Elon, it was, okay, actually, let me listen to what he is saying. And then I think there were still a lot of views and policies that Trump had that a lot of Silicon Valley didn't agree with. Then they looked at other ones and said, actually, I do agree with this, because they're hearing it from the voice of David Sachs, the voice of Andreessen, the voice of Elon, saying, okay, this is good for innovation, for tech companies. We can see where he is fully supportive of Trump. And I think that did swing a lot of votes. I think it was a lot of males, so men in Silicon Valley. And I think a lot of them were silent voters. They're the ones that if you're in a room in Silicon Valley talking about the election or votes, they kind of just don't say anything. And they voted for Trump.
Oh, that is exactly it. That is exactly it. I probably asked 40 or 50 of my buddies who are still in tech privately who they're voting for. And I would say 80%, maybe 75% said Trump. But all of them, to the person, said they would never admit that in public. They would either A, say they're not voting, or B, say the other side. So I think the quiet support was game changing. And really, when I stepped back from it, it wasn't the momentum, the long form content, Sachs, Musk. I actually think there were, policies, positions on the other side that were kind of non-starters for a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Silicon Valley. I actually have 4 that I wrote down. I think the number one we talked about before was unrealized gains. Now that came out. I think Mark Cuban quickly poo-pooed that, but there's no question that the Silicon Valley elites, especially venture capital, whose job is to allocate capital, probably have fat balance sheets with valuations that could be something, could be zero. Were particularly turned off by the threat of being a forced seller on illiquid assets, a la unrealized gains tax. What do you think?
Yeah, and just for those who are listening, who are not in the day-to-day world of Silicon Valley, a lot of companies will come out and be like, "Great, we just raised $100 million at a $500 million valuation." Remember, this is all on paper.
It's all
All of
smoke.
this is on
It's all
paper.
smoke, man. It's smoke.
It's the company has not sold. It has no liquidation event. Like, in other words, it hasn't gotten cash to say it's worth this much money. And so basically, when they were saying with unrealized gains for venture capitalists that they would have to pay on those, they would potentially have to pay taxes on something that is on paper. And as you know, many of these companies go to zero. That's the beauty of Silicon Valley, is that you can
Let's be
fail.
clear. More than half go to zero. It's
More
not
than
like,
half
not
goes
like a
to
couple.
zero. Yes. Majority of Silicon Valley and venture-backed companies go to zero. And that is the model of Silicon Valley. It's that you fail, but if you fail, you failed in a big way because you were trying to change the world, right? And so for anyone who's investing in startups, there's this concern of, wait, now I'm paying taxes on something that's worth nothing, so I made no money off of it, and now you're asking me to pay taxes. So there were certain types of policies like that. And to your point, I think Mark Cuban very quickly said, nah, that's not actually going to happen. That was a thought, but like that was more of a, hey, let's think about it. Let's figure out if we would potentially, if this would be a good thing. And I think it was quickly shut down. But on the flip side, it was, hey, who would even think about that?
Yeah.
Maybe
It's one of those things you don't
because
forget.
this wouldn't even come up. Yeah.
I mean, once you make a cataclysmic, they saw it as a threat, right? It's a threat to their business model, frankly. If you're going to start taxing on unrealized gains once a year, that's a threat to their business model.
Yep.
You're always going to be sensitive. So, okay, it didn't work that way, but they're coming for this. The government needs more taxes. I don't think anybody looks at that and says that's not coming. Obviously, they see us as money bags. They're going to come at us some way. So I could see why the threat was real and really was, a main issue for a lot of those folks. But again, a lot of those folks are, there's not a lot of them, right? They're not going to move the populace, but it was a threat. Number 2, let's go to this one. I think there is a lot of illiquidity in startups today. I think the SEC has clearly come out and not allowed the big tech companies to acquire and kind of add to their portfolios. They're really anti, acquisitions at this point. And, that's a lot of folks getting long in the tooth with startups, right? Pre-IPO. And again, it's a very valuable kind of economy, because if you can't, quote unquote, change the world and get escape velocity, another outcome is you get acquired. It's not 100 to 1, but maybe it's 10 to 1. Yep. And I think the SEC has really, again, changed the business model and had people carry businesses longer and longer and longer. And I think a lot of folks in the Valley, now this is broader than maybe the first issue of unrealized gains. A lot of people realized the SEC was being heavy-handed, and they wanted to change. I think it's Lena Khan, if I have that right.
Yes.
So I think that was number 2.
Yeah, it was. And I think to your point, Silicon Valley is now projecting and assuming there will be a lot more M&A. There will be a lot more activity nowadays. And that will, definitely.
Yeah. All right. So number 3, again, not to pick on, Fed appointees or government appointees, but it's going to be Gary Gensler. I think it's very clear. He had a speech the other day that sounded like his final speech. Again, Gary Gensler over at what is he in charge of? Not the SEC.
He's the SEC. Yeah, he's the
Oh, he's the
chairperson.
SEC.
of
Oh,
the
then I have
SEC.
Lena Khan wrong. So
Yeah.
I forget what Lena Khan's in charge of. Okay, Gary Gensler, SEC, has been very anti crypto and Bitcoin and this, that, and the other. So I think the Silicon Valley leans that direction. There are plenty of crypto projects that start up and spin up there. And again, I think the Silicon Valley probably leans pro crypto, if I were to guess, probably in a big way. So that's another thing that they saw as a net positive, was getting rid of Gary, I would think.
Yep. Yeah, definitely.
And what is Lena Khan in charge of? So I got that wrong. Is it the FTC?
No, so she is the FTC.
Yeah,
And
FTC.
Yes, and then he is the Securities and Exchange Trade Commission. What is that? That is the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Yeah. And then there was a final one that I think came up late in the election cycle that I think Silicon Valley was surprised by this. And it's really weird because, again, a lot of the companies in the Silicon Valley are having arrows thrown at them, rightly so, about free speech, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think there's always been a left-leaning bias. Certainly the media, certainly many of the big tech companies leaned heavily on the scale in the last election. And a lot of that has come to light. Again, thank Elon, Twitter, X, all of that. But I do think people in the Silicon Valley, at least my circle, we're talking more and more about free speech and the media being biased, which again, if you really think about it, it's the same as it was years ago, maybe slightly different. But to see the number of people talk about true free speech was very different in the last month than, my last 50 years. I don't know if you saw that.
Well, yeah, I think they tested. Silicon Valley had the best of intentions to test how do you control what's on the internet and how do you control what they consider to be fake news, right?
Yep.
But that in a utopia world, that makes complete sense to do.
It's a quality motive.
Exactly.
In theory.
But then suddenly you get into a gray area because there's so much gray in every speech, every single conversation that's a debate. There's like, great, I see this point, and this is great. And so the question was, okay, yes, if there is some sort of AI generated content of Michael Zuber saying something that he never said, that's truly fake, right?
Yep.
But then you start going into another gray area of, hey, Michael disagreed with this person's comments, maybe took it out of context, but someone else would say that wasn't out of context. And so I think what Silicon Valley did was try to be the best for everyone. And it started with the big platforms like the Facebooks of the world and the Twitters of the world, trying to regulate what people were saying. And then suddenly I think the rest of the US and also Silicon Valley was like, wait, we're having a couple of engineers and, content reviewers telling us what is right and what is wrong. Yeah. And I think in like this utopia world, that makes complete sense that you could do it, but it doesn't here because there's opinions and there's ways that people interpret certain statements. Yep. And so from that perspective, I think Silicon Valley tried it. And then I think Silicon Valley went back the other way and basically said, this is really hard for us to regulate. This is really hard for us to do. And it's only going to get worse. And so by us restricting free speech, that could be a concern. And then it was really interesting because with the Twitter, with Elon buying Twitter, he had seen that. I mean, I think in the data, it showed that there were things.
Their Twitter files?
Yeah, the Twitter files actually showing that content was it was not accurate, that they were basically saying, hey, don't show this.
No.
It was in someone's self-interest who was making that decision. And so I think that Silicon Valley has said, hey, we've tried it. We tried to make tech smarter than humans and help provide accuracy and making sure that people don't see things that are fake and think they're true. And now I think it's gone back to say, you know what, maybe you just need to identify who the person is. And when you follow people who've built their trust over time with their audience because they say what is true, they've done their research, etc., rather than trying to shield what folks and users are saying on these platforms. And so I think that was one of the big things that Silicon Valley has actually gone the other way. Maybe not everyone here, but a lot of people.
Yeah, there's no question that the motive. I'll say this: I think the motives were pure. Yeah. I'm going to say that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I think it was. But at the end of the day, once you throw people, moderators, reviewers in it, and again, if you're just really honest and you go back and look at political donations, again, the Valley's blue. I mean, it is what it is. And to think that there wasn't going to be some leaning on the scale, right, thumb on the scale kind of activity was kind of naive and frankly unfortunate, because it was predictable, right? It's humans are not machines, right? And that's interesting. So again, at the end of the day, I still think if you were to just poll the Silicon Valley, if you were just going to take that data set, it's still overwhelmingly voted blue. I think if you were to subsection what I'll call the Silicon Valley elite, you make that, number whatever you want. It wouldn't shock me if it went 60-40 the other way, right? I don't think it's a blowout. I don't think it's any of that. Again, the Silicon Valley elite being a much, much smaller number, but I think this election was different than any other election, I've been old enough to vote in, because it probably would have been 90-10 blue versus red in any other election.
Yeah. And it was just being here in San Francisco. For those who are not in San Francisco, I had never seen before, thought I would see Trump signs in windows.
Yeah.
And I actually
it was awesome.
saw Trump signs in windows, as well as cars driving by with Trump flags. And then when you got to the South Bay, it actually got even more pronounced and more proliferated. My twin sister's next door neighbor was hosting a fundraiser for JD Vance because she couldn't get to her house. And she was like, why can't I get to my house? And so then you saw it even more, I think, in the South Bay as well. And so, it's really interesting. I think the one good thing that came of the election is finally the US is starting to actually look at policies and starting to dive in a lot more. And I think education is really important. I think historically it was like, I vote blue, I vote red, and this is it. And now I think that, I think you're always going to have a two-state party, even though I'm a huge proponent of having three, and not having
more would be better. Yes.
Two-state obviously divides the nation in a negative way. But I do think that there's more research done, more people actually looking at policies and following podcasts and YouTubes and gaining their own opinions and insights of it. So I think
there's to that point. Yeah, to that point, I think it's Yang. I forget his first name. What? Anyways, he was running for president-elect. He didn't get it. He created a third party. I think there's a good chance that over the next...
that was Andrew Yang.
Andrew Yang. Thank you, Andrew Yang.
Yeah.
Over the next 3 election cycles, again, leveraging long-form content, being the voice of reason, I think there's a chance. It won't happen in 4 years, maybe 8, maybe 12. We get another Ross Perot. I remember Ross Perot. I actually voted for Ross Perot the first time. I love those charts. I remember when he threw up charts on my TV. I'm like, oh, I like this guy. He's throwing up charts. It was funny. I forget what year that was. That was funny. But let's talk about San Francisco. San Francisco got rid of the mayor. Yes. Got rid of London Breed, I think her name was. She is finally out. Even San Francisco can make a change.
Yeah, well, what was crazy was she did get second. So she did. I thought
doesn't matter. There's no second place.
I did not even think she would be on that list. But I think it's interesting with San Francisco because there's a lot of people who left San Francisco. The people who are in San Francisco do not want to admit that. I'm in San Francisco. I will admit that. A lot of people left, and what did they leave with? Their money. And you go
Absolutely.
downtown and you say this is a non-functioning society.
It could be a movie
And who's paying
theater.
for it? Us with our taxpayer dollars.
Yeah.
And so you had a lot of people swing the other way to say, listen, we've got to clean up the city. We've got to focus on the root cause. We've got to figure out how to get people into rehab. The people on the streets need homes and we need to take action. And whatever we're doing now doesn't work because our property taxes continue to increase. And what we're seeing happen is just getting worse. And so, yeah, I think anytime something goes this way, you've seen it with New York as well, it swings the other way. And I think, hopefully there is change coming because I think all of California needs quite a bit of change.
Yeah, and then the last thing I'll say about the election, very much California. I think it was 73% of us, or I don't actually vote in California anymore. I vote in Nevada, but 73% of the folks in California voted to make a crime again. Right, the shoplifting crime. There was
Yes,
it's now a crime.
Yes, yeah, it's the 700
or a felony. I guess it's not a. It switched from a misdemeanor back to a felony. I guess it was always technically a crime, but it wasn't treated as such. So,
but yeah, I mean, you from that perspective, it was just a misdemeanor. So yeah,
they just sign him up, let him go.
Exactly. I think from that perspective, will be interesting. Culture is hard to change.
Mm-hmm.
Government's hard to change. Everything's slow moving. But California did go in that direction, and I actually think that helped Trump significantly, tremendously.
Oh, I mean, did you see the California map last election versus this election? How red the center was?
How much red there was, especially in the middle. Totally.
Yeah, wild. And again, back to San Francisco. Again, it's still blue. It's just not as dark, crazy blue, right? The winner who beat London Breed is a Democrat. I actually don't even know if there was a Republican voting. Was there a Republican on the ballot for mayor? Was it all Democrats?
Because Mark, and then Daniel Lurie. Daniel was the one who won, and then London were all Democrats. I'm trying to think. I think there was one, but they probably it was a write-off. Yeah,
no chance.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think what Daniel Lurie really did, which was helpful, is he's actually been working on shelters and working on housing the homeless. Yeah. And that was like the number one issue, I think, for most voters here in San Francisco.
Yeah. Well, Dana, this is a lot of fun. I appreciate all you do. We'll get back to talking about business and the like, but I thought the change in the Valley was so almost unexpected, really.
Yeah.
That we should talk about it. Dana, you're amazing. Take care.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Mm-hmm.